Wrong with me? I'm old.
The story of the Clarence Thomas-Anita Hill confrontation starts in July of 1991 when Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall announced his retirement.
I think this is helpful because looking back, I didn't really remember how we got Clarence Thomas and what actually happened to, get to that hearing that became so infamous. So I think one thing that we try to do on the daily is give enough context so that we know how one thing led to another thing that led to this thing that we might remember, especially when we're doing a retrospective like this. Another thing, did anyone know that Justice Marshall sounded like that? I was so delighted by his voice. It sounded so lovely. And I think that finding those moments of surprise are also really nice. Paying attention to that and just if you're giving your listener a moment of pause during their morning commute, that's a good thing. Even if it's just in someone's voice and someone's demeanor, in something that isn't integral to the story, but it helps you kind of get into it. It makes it a little bit more human. There's also, has anyone heard that Nancy Updike talk, Die Mediocrity Die? It's from Third Coast from a few years ago. It's a wonderful talk, and one of the things that she says is, she plays this tape from Iraq, and it's someone ordering food at a Chinese restaurant, and she plays the tape first, and she's like, does this mean anything to you? And everyone's kind of like, no. She's like, do you find it compelling? And they're like, no, not really. And then she plays her tape as it appears in the story, as you hear it in the story. And it's her talking first. It's her narration first. And it sets up the clip so beautifully. And then the Chinese restaurant in Iraq clip plays, and it lands because there's all this setup that she does beforehand. It's beautiful and it's wonderful, and I love her work. And at the Daily, we just do something different. We lead with tape a lot of times, and I think that that's a fun way to set the scene. So you're in this press conference with Thurgood Marshall, and that's how you lead. People don't totally know what's going on. They don't know who's speaking. It's a little bit disorienting, but that helps to build that feeling of suspense. And then the payoff is right there. The narrator comes in, the reporter comes in, and she's like, oh yeah, that's Thurgood Marshall. He's retiring. And that's why this other stuff is about to happen.
I have followed this man's career for some time, and he has excelled in everything that he has attempted.
President George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, nominated Clarence Thomas, a conservative judge, to replace him.
And I trust that the Senate will confirm this able man promptly.
So you hear this familiar voice. It's George Bush Sr. And then the reporter comes in. She's sort of sandwiched within the tape. I think that sort of keeps you in the scene. I don't really have much more to say about that. But what I do like about it, though, is that have you ever watched a really complicated movie where maybe you're sitting with a friend and you're the annoying friend, and you're like, wait, who's that guy? And what's going on? And your friend's like, I've been here for the same amount of time that you've been here. We've seen the same stuff. But maybe that friend is helping you a little bit, and that friend is like, that's the guy that did all the crimes, and that's the guy that was hiding in a box in the previous scene. You remember, and your friend helps you. I think a good podcast helps orient your listener, and it helps get everyone on the same page. So talking about what happened and giving everyone sort of a level playing field can help the analysis land later so much because we're all on the same page as to what happened. That's sort of what happened in this episode. There's a TikTok, as everyone says at the New York Times, which I didn't know that until I started working there, but that's what you call a timeline of events or something. In any other news industry place, outlet, do people say that? Yeah, let's do a TikTok right there. I didn't know, and now I say it and I feel cool because I'm using lingo, but yeah, you do the TikTok first, and then comes analysis. Anyway.
Kate Zernike covers politics for The Times.
The hearings start in September.
The hearing will come to order.
There are questions about Clarence Thomas's fairly conservative legal record, but that's not a surprise to the senators who are asking questions.
Okay. There's something in there that I wish I hadn't done in this tape. Does anyone did anyone hear anything that they thought was weird? usually, like, we try to avoid stepping on tape. So she's like, then a court hearing happened. And then you hear Joe Biden being like, the hearing will come to order. It doesn't really add anything to the scene. And I don't know if we really needed that. I think if I were to do it again, I probably just would have cut that tape, but it's a daily show, so. Yeah.
So it looks as if this is probably going to be a fairly straightforward confirmation. But meanwhile, there's a parallel story developing. There are these rumors out there.
Okay. So, and then I'm pausing here because this is when you like realize why you're listening. This is when you realize like, oh, like I know what this parallel story is, and the stakes are upped, and there's a little bit of suspense, and the music bump helps signal to you that something, there's a tone shift. At first it was just, oh yeah, all this stuff was happening, it was fine, but the music is supposed to signal that maybe something sinister is around the way.
That Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed women in the workplace. So Senate staffers are sort of looking behind the scenes, trying to figure out who this is, and they get a lead on one woman, and her name is Anita Hill. So right before the hearing starts.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I guess I'm curious. I don't have anything else to say about those 2 minutes, aside from what we already covered, which is in those 2 minutes, you have your characters, you have the stakes, you have a little bit of like pacing and suspense and some music to help, augment the emotional side of the story that we're about to tell. I was wondering if anyone else heard anything that maybe stood out, or maybe that you liked or you didn't like, or I don't know, just anything at all before we move on. Yeah, what's up?
Did that reporter cover the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas hearings?
Not back in the day, but she did some like retrospective stuff. We actually had an episode on a weekend called The Year of the Woman, and she was the person who covered it then, and so she had a lot of that stuff kind of like fresh in her mind, and she had studied up, and she covers politics, and so she, like, there have been other sort of related stories that she had covered as well. And then we kind of like work with our reporters and sort of coach them on what parts of the story we need to tell the story, and then they help fill in the gaps that we might not necessarily have because we haven't been reporting this for as long as them. So, yeah. Cool. Before we move on to still processing, one thing that I like to keep in mind is something that I stole from grad school. It has to do with, it's this educational philosopher, Paulo Freire, talked about ingenuous versus epistemological curiosity. And ingenuous curiosity is that feeling that you have when you're a little kid and you're like, why is the grass green and why is the sky blue? And it's that question, that curiosity that you have where you just want to understand the world around you. And epistemological curiosity, that was a terrible pee-pop, I'm sorry. Epistemological curiosity, I did it again, I can't stop. It's like off to the side, I know. See, I produce though, I'm not behind the mic all that much. Epistemological curiosity is how you know what you know. It's sort of using like a thoughtful, methodical strategy to kind of understand how you know what you know. And so whether it's in the daily or whether it's in still processing, I think a lot of times, like if a question is posed or something, I want to understand like what informs how people come to their understanding of whatever it is that they're talking about. And I always want to start from that ingenuous place because that's the thing. If you start with like the theory and all the heady stuff, I just feel like it's hard to follow. But if you start with like, I wonder if I should listen to Kanye anymore. Like that, that's a question that I feel like I've heard a lot of my friends ask and that I've talked about before. And so if you build the episode around that ingenuous place and ask certain questions, you can get to the epistemological place. But I really like starting with the ingenuous. Anyway, here's the Kanye clip from Still Processing.
And he needs to know that you're not free because the rest of us aren't free, no matter how much money you have, no matter who your wife is, no matter what family you've married into. He didn't have to make this album. He chose to make this album and be in the public eye in this way. So he is accountable to all of us. And I don't think he likes it.
That is it. And I think that you, no, really, I mean, this is the thing that I really struggle with this, Jen. I mean, I emotionally struggle with it.
You saw me crying at the bar on Friday when we met up to talk.
I just, the state of his mental health is one thing, but I think he really does feel something that he can't really articulate as a Black person. I mean, because he is as close as he's ever gonna be to whatever it is he thinks freedom is. I mean, you know, he has survived being married to the Kardashians. He has aligned himself with this very powerful white man who believes that his whiteness is better than anybody else's anything else. And I just feel like he is tasting something that is rotten at its core. And I think that part of the reason I'm so emotional is because it's the exact poison that I feel I'm capable of having every day. Somebody offers me an apple. Do I bite it? Seems good. But I can't because I think it'll make all my other Black people sick.
Maybe Beyonce can get him a copy of The Bluest Eye. I honestly feel like, no, I'm serious, because we had the Beychella conversation. We talked about someone who is not interested in affirming white supremacy. Kanye's confusing Black power with white supremacy. So he has to break free. He has to break free. He needs to be a freer thinker. Oh, man. Deep sigh.
That's our show.
So I played you an intro of The Daily and then an outro of Still Processing from our episode, We Wouldn't Leave Kanye, but should we? I guess I wanted to play this because there was a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff that happened that I think y'all might find interesting. And, you know, this is a totally different scene from The Daily. The Daily is like this highly structured, super narrative show. And Still Processing is like a super heady intellectual chat show. One thing that I adore is having hosts that are willing to be so vulnerable and are cool with like me using that really wonderful tape, but that also means putting yourself out there in a certain way. So like, I think finding people to work with that are kind of like willing to engage with their humanity in really honest ways. That doesn't mean that everything makes it into the show, but I'm like, having that perspective I think can be really helpful. That said, when that emotional moment came up during the recording, you know, it kind of came out of nowhere. And as the producer, there has to be a moment where like you appreciate the moment for what it is. And then you take a step back and then you say, that moment wasn't really earned, so we need to go back and do pickups so that we can actually get to that point, you know? And that's kind of a hard thing to do, but I think it's worth it because everyone else isn't in the room with us, you know? And in order for the rest of the audience to really like feel what Wesley was feeling in that moment, we need to make sure that there is like a narrative arc to this conversation. It's not exactly structured in the same way that you would structure an episode of The Daily. However, like we want to make sure that a lot of the points he's talking about are like, there's some scaffolding that helps get you there. Could y'all hear any of those pickups? Then I did my job. Let's see. Yeah, and one thing that guides that is like this question, like what are we trying to leave listeners with? It doesn't necessarily mean answers. Like Wesley and Jen are always like, we're not trying to like tell people what to do. We're not trying to leave people with answers, but again, going with this idea of ingenuous to epistemological, starting with that curiosity and then pursuing that curiosity so that you can understand like whatever conclusion you come to, even if it's not sort of like a prescriptive conclusion, even if it's just sort of like something to stand on, people understand how you got there. That's what we're trying to do. So we did a bunch of pickups and finally like got to a place where we felt good about like leading people to this very emotional moment. Let's see. Was there anything that anyone want to say about those 2 minutes? Anything that stood out or, yeah.
Question, when is it coming
Oh, it's coming back in January. So in our last episode on Aretha Franklin, that was the season finale, and we mentioned that we'd be back sometime, but I think we said we'd be back in the fall, but fall is in January. What even is time?
Build the anticipation and suspense.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, pacing. Whoever, yeah. What's up?
I'm curious if you remember what you said to Wesley and Jenna to get them to back up and explain themselves. Do you know how you got that information out of them to get them?
Yeah, definitely. First off, I think we took a pause, let the moment sink in, and then we kind of tried to ask what happened in that moment. Wesley was saying that he was identifying something in Kanye that he could identify in himself, and some of the choices that Kanye was making seemed to sell out the communities that he was from. And Wesley says that he sort of felt that in a similar way. So what are moments in Kanye's trajectory that might show why that kind of betrayal would feel so bad? So showing how he was kind of the epitome of solidarity for the Black community in the early aughts, that kind of establishes him as one type of character in the beginning of the episode when you're talking about College Dropout, And then when you start to get to after Donda dies, after his mom dies, you start to see certain concessions that he starts to make, certain changes in his personality. So we wanted to make sure that the album that we're talking about now, if we're talking about 808s and heartbreak, what is the thing that shows sort of the beginning of the change in Kanye? What is something that shows the beginning of why ultimately at the end of this episode, when we encounter this betrayal and he's wearing a Make America Great Again hat and talking about his support for Donald Trump and blaming the Black community for slavery, essentially, when he's doing all these things, why is that so infuriating? It's because that's the same guy that at the beginning of the episode we established came out on TV and called out George Bush for not caring about Black people during Katrina. So I think figuring out, okay, what are the moments that we have to hit to make this landing really land? We kind of come up with together, and then we figure out, oh, did we hit those marks? If we did, great, but sometimes we didn't, and so we just figured out in the moment, how do we flesh it out around, But I think actually we didn't have any more studio time. This is before we had real studios, and so we had to record the next day, and it was kind of a whole new energy, and that's always a little bit hard to match. So yeah, there's all these pros and cons to doing pickups in different ways, but yeah.
We'll get to more questions at the end. I just want to move on to the next presenter, but thank you, Neena. You're going to switch the audio cable.
Here you go. Thanks.
So Laura Starcheski sitting next to me. She's the senior reporter and producer for Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting, where her work has won many awards, including National Edward R. Murrow Award. She was previously at NPR Science Desk and a staffer at the amazing State of the Reunion, RIP. Yeah. Her Radiolab story, Goat on a Cow, won a Third Coast Silver Award for Best Documentary, and State of Reunion's The Hospital Always Wins won a Murrow Award, and I really encourage you to listen to both those stories. They're so good. And she's also my neighbor on 52nd Street. Here's Laura Starcheski.
Thanks, Alex. I'm so psyched to be here. I'm huge fans of these two, and Alex is my neighbor. And thanks to the Asian American Journalists Association for inviting me. I'm super honored. This is a very cute and cozy house to be in. So I'm glad to be here. Thanks. I'll just say a little bit about Reveal. If you haven't heard the show before, we're a weekly 1-hour show, and it's all investigative reporting. And I hope that if you're not super familiar with investigative reporting, which to tell you the truth, I wasn't before I started working there, you will be a little bit more familiar by the time I get through the talk. I'm going to play a bunch of tape from one of our episodes and kind of touch on some of the investigative elements that come out throughout the episode. So just a little bit more about my role at the show. So Neena was talking about being a producer, and a lot of the time I'm doing that, you know, helping other reporters and hosts bring their work to the air. So a lot of behind the scenes stuff, scripting, being in the booth when people are recording narration, coaching, helping with pacing and structuring, all of that stuff that you do when you're putting together an audio piece. And sometimes I'm actually out in the field reporting. So I'm gonna play some clips from one story where I was out in the field reporting. I also was helping produce this hour, and Alex told me that he wanted me to go second because Reveal is often such a dark show, and it was like hard to lead with, but also like not ideal to end with. But I did choose like the episode that I think I had the most fun working on. I think I do like really try to make a point of having fun when I'm working on stories for Reveal as much as I can, just because a lot of our topics are so super heavy. But I'm just going to play how we got into the top of the hour, and then I'll say a little bit more about it.
From the Center for Investigative Reporting and PRX, this is Reveal. I'm Al Letson. Driving through Joplin, Missouri, you can see signs of a huge tornado that hit the city back in 2011. A lot of homes and businesses were destroyed, and there are all these empty lots that were never redeveloped. In the middle of one is the place reporters Laura Starcheski and Amanda Robb are looking for.
Oh my God.
There it is.
It's a food truck.
It's a food truck. Okay.
It's a smoothie place called Pineapple Bliss.
Is it closed?
That's Laura.
Can I ask you a question?
And that's Amanda.
I'm trying to find somebody I've been following on Facebook, and she liked Pineapple Bliss.
Who is it?
Her name's Carmen Katz. She goes by Carmen Katz on Facebook. Do you know who it is? No idea?
The thing is, they're not even sure if the person they're looking for is real.
If I show you a picture of her cat, would that help?
Amanda and Laura are trying to find this person because she was the first person we found who posted anything on Facebook about one of the most bizarre fake news stories of 2016, Pizzagate.
Okay, Pizzagate. Does anyone not know what Pizzagate was? I'll just remind you in case you weren't obsessively following this like I was at the time. But it was a takedown conspiracy theory about Hillary Clinton that eventually ensnared lots of other people. But the basic conspiracy theory was that Hillary Clinton is a pedophile, and she runs a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. called Comet Ping Pong. So if you did hear about this story at all, you might have heard about it after the election was over on December 4th, 2016, when a shooter went to that pizzeria and fired shots inside. So this is some of the Reveal dark part. But luckily no one was hurt, and he surrendered once he realized that there were no children to rescue. And Amanda Robb, the reporter who was with me on this story, is an amazing print reporter, writer. She was working on a long-form piece for Rolling Stone. She's done a lot of reporting on violence coming from the political right in America. So as soon as that happened, like, her ears really perked up. She started looking into it, and we were interested in it because, you know, this conspiracy theory could have changed the outcome of the presidential election. So to us, it seemed really worth digging into where it came from. So I'm going to play another clip. I think in any narrative reported story, it's important to have like a simple question that you're trying to answer, but especially in investigative stuff, because it can get kind of big and complicated. So in this clip, I kind of set up our main question, and then I'll let it play as Amanda and I kind of go off on our quest. Was there somebody who planted the story, and why would they do that?
And the first clue you guys had was Carmen Katz's Facebook post. It went up on October 29th, 10 days before the election. Laura, why don't you read some of that post for us?
Okay. It says, My NYPD source said it's much more vile and serious. We're talking an international child enslavement and sex ring. Not even Hillary's most ardent supporters and defenders will be able to excuse this! Exclamation point. Okay, so you guys are following. This is the post posted by the woman, Carmen Katz, who we were searching for in Joplin, Missouri. In part, the post was actually much longer and weirder than that.
Carmen's profile says she lives in Joplin, but there's no Carmen Katz in the phone book there, and her profile picture is just a photo of a gray and white cat.
And so since she was like the first poster that we could find, Amanda and I decided, like, okay, well, we've got to go to Missouri and try to find her and figure out, like, how did she know about this and where did she get it from? Why did she post this?
And so that's how we went to Joplin with a picture of the cat.
So both of you travel down to Joplin, Missouri to find a woman, and all you go armed with is a picture of a cat.
You're following the story really well.
Meow.
Our whole plan was to go to businesses that Carmen liked on Facebook. So the next place we went was Jugs Liquor, Jugz, because Carmen Katz said she had bought a bottle of Bones rum at this liquor store that was signed by the person who made it. So we were like, okay, that sounds like a memory. That's not just I picked up a bottle of rum. Maybe they'll remember her.
Have you tried Bones rum? No. Step into my lair.
So the owner, Lynetta, she brings us behind this makeshift bar, and she fixed us a pretty disgusting cocktail that had Bones rum and chocolate wine in it.
That sounds utterly disgusting.
It was. It was disgusting. She kind of acknowledged that it should be disgusting, but she really liked it. This was all before noon, by the way, on a Saturday. And we drank the chocolate s'mores drink with her, but she had no idea who Carmen Katz was.
I wish you knew who Carmen Katz was. I wish I could find her because I'd go smack her myself. I'm not a Hillary fan, but that's the stupid crap that just makes people look stupid. And she better not be from Missouri.
Okay, so in that scene, you can kind of hear some of the model for how we chose to tell the whole story. So Amanda and I are out in the world trying to make this story that's really about the internet as real as possible, and then we're bringing tape and tales back to our host Al and kind of telling the story to him. We didn't script any of it. We had kind of bullet points for what we wanted to tell him, and we had a lot of tape to play him, but we tried to really keep this one as loose as possible. I think we probably spent, I don't know, maybe 10 hours in the studio to get the hour of usable narration, something like that, 8 to 10 hours, and that was that like fun, non-scripted narration technique is one that I learned at Radiolab when I did a story for them. When I was lucky enough to be like very early producer and thought that was normal. So I was like, oh, fun, we don't have a script. We'll just like tell the story and see where it goes. And I still love telling stories that way as much as possible. So I hope that you're really wondering if we found Carmen Katz, but you're going to have to listen to the episode to find out. But I can tell you what happened to her post. So she writes this post on Facebook, and then you know, the source for her that she's saying where she's getting this information that Hillary Clinton is a pedophile and all of these other horrible things is she claims she knows someone in the NYPD. And this is because there was part of the theory is that these emails kind of that some of Hillary's emails were recovered when Anthony Weiner's laptop was seized after he was arrested. So the NYPD was involved, so that's kind of what the NYPD source is like an important part of this theory. So Carmen says, I knew something about this NYPD source. Someone screenshots her post and tweets it, and they say, yes, me too. Like, I also know someone in the NYPD, and I heard the same thing. And then that tweet gets picked up by a fake news website called yournewswire.com that's out of LA. run by a businessman who probably made a ton of money on it. And then it just kind of busts out into the kind of right-wing conspiracy world. And the first time that we actually got to confront someone who propagated this theory was when we found this gentleman who is a private detective who brought this conspiracy theory to InfoWars, the webcast and radio show from Alex Jones. If you've ever been unfortunate enough to hear it, it's just a completely outlandish right-wing conspiracy news show. That is like so many hours a day. I mean, there's so much of it. It's really unreal. So anyway, we found this private detective who basically mined all of this social media content, brought the story to Alex Jones, and Alex Jones has an audience of millions. So this is kind of the moment when the story busts out, and this was the first time we actually got to talk to someone. So I'm just going to play you this section of the story. It's about 3 minutes. The first person who actually launched the Pizzagate story on InfoWars was this private investigator living in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Doug Hagman, thank you for joining us, sir. Take over.
Alex, thanks for having me. Yeah, basically everything that you've come up with, my source independent of yours has said. Right.
Hagman goes on to say that his source knows someone who's affiliated with the NYPD who told him that there's proof of the Pizzagate conspiracy.
All of the components are here to expose the greatest perversion, the greatest satanic, and I mean satanic, cabal of people that are associated with Hillary Clinton and the people in the halls of of power in the United States.
So we called Mr. Hagman, and he said we could come up and see his courtroom-ready documents proving that the former Secretary of State is running a pedophile ring.
Hi. You Mrs. Hagman?
Yeah, I'm Renee Hagman.
Oh, hi. I'm Amanda.
Hi, Amanda.
Nice to meet you. This is my colleague, Laura. Hi. Nice to meet you.
She won't bite.
So we went to his basement studio, which is unbelievably decked out. There's an anchor chair and everything. And we asked for the courtroom-ready documents, and he said they were at the copiers and that he hadn't kept a copy. I mean, on the second, you made a big declaration to the world.
I did. And that is based on I made that based in large part on the information I received from my source.
Okay.
Okay.
And you trust him so much, you
I
didn't
do.
have to go back and check it with anybody. You really believe him.
I think that's a little bit. I think that there was enough supporting evidence or supporting documentation, not evidence, but documentation to substantiate the veracity of his assertions. Now,
But what documentation? We don't have any.
okay, if you look, okay. Well, that's true. No, we don't have any direct. You're going to hit me, aren't you?
So he claimed to have courtroom-ready documents, and he didn't have anything?
No.
It seems to me like he's, I don't know, embarrassed to be confronted by you guys.
I thought I was going to have to carry Laura out in my arms. She was so sad for him. I mean, it was humiliating. It was awful. And, his former claim to fame, we looked him up, was he helped break up a cable pirating ring in Erie. And those are his bona fides.
For me, as an investigator, I understand how crazy stupid this sounds and how little evidence that is actionable I can give to you. So I get that.
And that's who Alex Jones' expert is. So Hagman doesn't check his sources, and Jones doesn't check his experts, and out goes the story.
So as you're starting to gather, there was really a long chain of unreliable narrators in this reporting, which made it very confusing. It was probably we're reporting on something that in itself isn't true. So it just was a very backwards way. We were constantly having to kind of sift through such a volume of lies that it just became very disorienting. But part of the reason I wanted to play that cut is because you know that moment when Amanda, says, "Want documentation? We don't have any." She's so frustrated, and then he's like, "Yeah, you're right. We don't have it." That's like the moment that investigative reporters live for, because it's the accountability moment. You're getting to find the person who's responsible for the harm, because often investigative reporting is focused on a harm, and you're holding them accountable. As you can tell, I was cringing during the whole time when that was happening, because he was a pretty pathetic figure. But I love the way Amanda handled that interview. It was so fun to watch her, and it was a very difficult and confusing story to report, but we did have one other kind of investigative element in our back pocket that really helped sift through all the confusing stuff, and that was data. So this is the last cut I'm going to play, but luckily Amanda got a hold of basically a huge data set of tweets from the time that Carmen Katz posted her post on Facebook on October 30th to the shooting on December 4th, 2016. She hooked up with this computer scientist in Indiana who had gotten a sample of about 1.5 million tweets about Pizzagate that were tweeted during that time. He got a 10% sample, so somewhere around 140,000 tweets. And we have a really great data reporting team at Reveal that could handle a data set like that and help us understand what was really happening on Twitter. Twitter wasn't the only platform the story spread on, but that was what we had, so that's what we went with. And we were able to kind of look through and see exactly which InfoWars episodes really caught on and created a lot of Twitter traffic. And we were able to, unfortunately, see that like the biggest bump in traffic was about a week after the election when the New York Times decided to do a debunking story, trying to explain what Pizzagate was and debunk it and actually, tell some of the truth about some of the people spreading it, and that only made it go even more viral than before. So as a reporter, that might have been the low, the low moment. But one other thing that we were able to do with this data was look at the specific accounts that were tweeting about Pizzagate. So it was another way to kind of figure out who were the people who were really into this, who were spreading it a lot. And we found that about 40% of the accounts were bots. So no person behind them, just an automated account. And then just a few weeks before we were finishing reporting, Congress released some information that allowed us to answer one of the kind of burning questions that we had at that time. So we ended up reporting this story for about 9 months. And during that time, the investigation into Russian influence in the election was ongoing. And we had been wondering the whole time what was Amanda, I didn't play this part, but Amanda ended up going to Macedonia and talking to people who run fake news sites there. So we were really wondering about other influences and especially Russian influence in spreading the story. So we got to answer that question when Congress released this information. So we worked with another we worked with another Reveal reporter named Aaron Sankin, who is like this wonderful internet-obsessed person. He's our cybersecurity reporter. As you can tell, investigative stuff also takes like so many people. There were 3 newsrooms involved in this. So you'll hear a little bit from Aaron in this last scene. Congress just released a list of social media accounts that their investigators say were set up and run by a Russian company called the Internet Research Agency. The company's tied to the Kremlin, and we wanted to see if any of those accounts turned up on our list of Pizzagate tweets. So we brought in someone on the Reveal staff who's just as obsessed with Pizzagate as me and Amanda. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, how's it going?
Aaron Sankin is Reveal's internet and cybersecurity reporter.
What we basically want to know from you is is there evidence that Pizzagate was spread by Russia?
So from our initial sample of people who tweeted about Pizzagate between October 30th and December 4th of last year, we found 15 tweets that came from Russian propaganda accounts. The earliest of these tweets on November 8th came from
hold on.
You're going
Wait,
slow down.
We found 15 Pizzagate tweets that came right from these Russian propaganda accounts.
Yep.
It's mind-blowing to me. It is mind-blowing to me.
The earliest of these tweets, which was on November 8th, came from an account with the handle Calvin Chambers, and it also tagged conservative Fox Media personalities Sean Hannity and Lou Dobbs.
To try to get them to kind of like latch onto it and push it out themselves.
Yeah, I think it was an attempt to spread this to people with a larger public platform to spread the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So there was another account, Garrett Simpson, that retweeted a tweet from the Trump-supporting former sitcom star Roseanne Barr on November 23rd.
Oh my God.
So it's kind of like a word salad of a whole bunch of different far-right conspiracy theories that loop in Pizzagate.
Okay, wait. So that's a tweet from Roseanne Barr that was retweeted by one of these Russian accounts.
Yeah.
Okay. So Roseanne Barr tweeted about Pizzagate, then a Russian propaganda account liked it and retweeted it. They thought, this is a good thing, will help get out there.
Yeah, I think so. Or they just, were fans of the Roseanne show, which was a great show in the 90s.
Okay, so this was obviously before the Roseanne reboot and before Roseanne tanked the reboot. But I'll end there and save more time for questions and everything afterward. But just a final Pizzagate update. It's now been subsumed into this much larger conspiracy theory that kind of covers everything you could possibly imagine. Illuminati, Pizzagate, it's called QAnon, and Roseanne got really into that too. Everybody's nodding. Good, you guys are well versed. I guess just to bring back that characteristic reveal darkness, I wish this story wasn't really relevant anymore, but in the end, we tried to do accountability interviews with Twitter and Facebook. We got nowhere getting any answers from them about how they were planning to control some of this, and I think we're just seeing that it's very, very difficult to control, and their efforts to control fake news don't work very well. So as we go into the midterms, I'm still spending a lot of time thinking about what the next Pizzagate is going to be.
Thank you, Laura.
Mm-hmm.
We'll switch the audio again. Last, we have Kathy Tu. She's the co-host and co-managing editor of Nancy, from a podcast from WNYC, which features queer stories and conversations, and it's hosted by Kathy and Tobin Lowe. Before then, Kathy worked on a bunch of amazing shows on The Memory Palace, on Mortified Podcast, Radio Lab, and then prior to that, she was an EMT and law school graduate. And like Neena and myself, she also attended the Transom Story Workshop on Woods Hole. Here's Kathy Tu.
Hi. I usually do this with my co-host Tobin. We both, there he is. We usually do this together, so if there's any awkward pauses, it's because I'm waiting for him to speak, but he's not going to. We just put together this talk maybe 2 weeks ago, and now I cut it in half because I cut Tobin out, and it's now just me. Okay, so Nancy, if you don't know the show, it's a podcast from WYNC Studios. We are queer storytellers telling queer stories about queer people, for queer people. And we're on season 4. It's only been like a year and a half. I don't know how we're on season 4 already. But we've made over 50 episodes, and this latest season is our longest season, in which we're doing like a laughable 40 episodes. I don't know why we're doing that. But okay, so when we're first starting, one of the great things about working at WYNC is that you can talk to people to help you. So one of the people we talked to was Jad at Radio Lab, which, okay, by the way, he shows me that people can be a genius and be super nice at the same time. And he's just such a nice guy. So he told us that a couple of pieces of advice. The first one was try a bunch of things and then see what feels authentic for you. And the other thing is he told us to create like a podcast bill of rights, which sort of lays out the kind of stories that we want to tell. They're not like unique things, but it's what is going to make a Nancy story work for us. So this is what we came up with. And I think today I'll just go through the 9 points, and some of them I'll have tape, some of them I don't, because again, I cut out Tobin. So I think we'll do that. Yeah. The first one is Laugh, Laugh, Cry, Laugh, which is a model that pretty sure I stole from somebody who was talking about their story on maybe The Moth, I think. He said that his wife told him his best stories are when he makes people laugh and then laugh some more and then make them cry and then end with some sort of laugh. And so that's how we ended up structuring our first few episodes. And we started with our coming out stories, mainly my coming out story, in which I learned that you don't just come out once, you come out many times, especially if your mom decides to ignore you the first few times that you've come out to her. So I recorded, I think, my third time coming out, and kind of like wrestled it into the story. And we decided, and then Tobin told his story about how he came out to his parents, but it was complicated because his dad was really into Queer Eye and was like, I'm super into this show, and Tobin felt complicated about it because it wasn't him. And so we just had very different coming out stories. And that was our first episode because we wanted to, first of all, get vulnerable and show that everybody on this show is going to get vulnerable if they want to be, but for the most part they will. And that we're going to start with coming out stories, and then we're going to move on from there because there's a whole life to queer people than just coming out to their families. Next, a lot of our stories start out with us in an editorial meeting saying, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but. So for example, I've said in an editorial meeting, I'm afraid of being in a place where there's a lot of queer women. And then they sent me to a camp with a lot of queer women, and that became a story. I've also said I'm afraid of appearing butch, and then Tobin was like, maybe cut your hair, make that a story. And that happened. And Tobin at one point said, I'm embarrassed to admit that I have body image issues. And so he made a story about that where a friend of his is a classic Insta-gay, you know what I mean? Like he's very fit, very artistic, goes on vacation with other very fit people, posts those photos online, and he kept inviting Tobin to these pool parties, and Tobin's like, I cannot go because you're very fit. So they finally had a conversation about it, and it was honest, and I think he still feels like he still hasn't gone to a pool party with him, I think. But it was just an honest thing because I feel like in the media, queer people are often seen as very confident, and sometimes that's just not the case. And so frequently we start a story idea with, this is what I'm like embarrassed to talk about, I feel shameful about, and then we try to explore it from there. Okay, here's a word that I have a hard time pronouncing, the epiphanic moment. So this is not unique to us. This is like radio gold. If you can have somebody on tape realizing something, it is the best. So my example is we had a story in the first season about this woman named Sarah, who's on the left in this photo. Sarah Lou, she came and told us that when she was younger, you listened to the story, haven't you? Yeah, I can see it in your eyes. She told us that when she was like 11, she met this woman named Maura, who owned this general store, and it was the first time that she saw somebody as a grown queer adult, and she was like, I can be somebody. I can be a grown-up and be queer. And for our episode, she found Maura, and they had a conversation, and I'm gonna play this clip.
Being a little awkward 12-year-old gay kid, and then seeing a very charming, confident gay adult, it allowed me to imagine an adult version of myself, which was huge. But also the layer of my parents thought you were cool. And so that made me think that they would approve of me being gay.
Wow.
So that's a lot. Do you have any reaction
Get up
to
off
that?
the floor. Thank you. That is I am getting choked up. Yeah, thank you. Ooh, I never knew that I could.
It's okay.
That I could actually be a role model for somebody.
Sometimes you just need that very close to crying, but not quite crying that people love. But we try to put people in situations where they can reach a moment of clarity that way, or something along those lines, because I think that's just a very, very vulnerable place to be. And we try to set things up so that these moments can happen on tape, if possible. It doesn't always work out, but you never know. Knowing and understanding people well. This guy that you see, his name is David Ermold, and he was half of a gay couple that was turned down for a marriage license in 2015 by good old Kim Davis, who I cropped out of this photo. And then I think was it this past May or the May before? This past May, David ran to unseat Kim. And Tobin went down there, spent a week basically with him in his campaign. And, the media was basically like, this is him getting his revenge. And of course we have to all support him. But when Tobin went down there and spent a lot of time with him, he found that there was actually he was feeling the weight of the national attention. And he was doing this for himself and his partner, but the weight of the national attention was a lot for him. And that's not something that we could have figured out by just dropping in for a day to talk to him for one interview, talk to him on the phone. It really requires a lot of time talking to somebody, getting to know them, going out with them, knocking on doors with them to figure it out. So it takes a lot of time, but that's where you get the good tape and the good stories, and then meet great people. I don't want to sound like this is only for work. All right, silliness. This is my favorite part because I really enjoy the laugh part, and all we hear on Twitter is that our show makes people cry all the time. That's all we hear. Even the episodes where I'm like, there's no way anybody's gonna cry here. People cry. They're just always crying. Not always sad tears, but tears of joy is still crying to me. So I really enjoy when we get to be silly. This person is comedian Patty Harrison. When Trump decided to ban trans folks from the military, she was somebody that went on sort of as a talking head, but a funny talking head on shows I think it was was it the late night, one of the late night shows, Jimmy Fallon? I forget which one he hosts. But she basically had to, talk about what this means for trans people in a funny way. She was sort of the trans comedian. So we had her on the show, and we got into that a little bit. But we also got into a lot of her really silly comedy, and she has dark, weird comedy that people are kind of thrown off by when they first hear her. But this is my favorite part from the interview. I'm gonna play it because it brings me so much joy.
We don't have a good segue about this, but
Yeah.
You're obsessed with Laura Dern, and can we just talk about that for a little bit?
I was obsessed with Laura Dern because Jurassic Park for a solid 4 years of my childhood was the only movie that I watched. Wow. I loved Jurassic Park because I was like, I'm going to be an archaeologist. And then I just loved her outfit. And I loved the way she ran with that flashlight attached to her foot. And I loved the way she said, run. Run. What is it? It's oh, Mr. Arnold, I think we're back in business. And it's and its head comes through.
Wow.
Also, I always think of her convulsive crying run when she sees him again. She's
yeah.
She really sells that part.
So I love that. because we just want to really make sure that when we're telling our stories that we also tell stories about joy and queer joy and moments of queer joy, especially in our administration when it feels like every week we get worse and worse news. So that is a very deliberate decision that we make to try to get some joy in there somewhere. But sometimes that joy also makes people cry. So, yeah. Okay, so the next one, involved reporter. This is usually Tobin's part, so let me just read this real quick. Oh, right. Okay. When people pitch our show, I think one of our most frequent pieces of feedback is what is at stake for you in this story? Because we like to get our reporters involved in the stories that they're telling. And when I think it was like last January, not this past January, the January before, Tobin and I went down, and producer Matt went down to Orlando to sort of look at what the aftermath of the Pulse shooting was like. And we hung out with a bunch of different community groups that were basically formed to help survivors cope with this devastation. And we usually play a clip here of a pastor who had a major change of heart when he realized that he looked at the list of victims' names and he didn't recognize any one of them. And it's because, he runs a mega church there. It's because his community wasn't basically servicing the queer community at all. So he had a change of heart, and Tobin talked to him and basically was like, I'm like a de facto leader in our community because I'm helping tell stories, and you lead such a big congregation. Like, what is that like? And the pastor basically had like the tiniest of breakdowns, and he talked about how pastors are just people that care about other people, and he just couldn't believe that he did not know anybody that had passed away during Pulse. So I guess that's just a roundabout way of talking about, like, we just want to get as involved as the reporter as possible to try to get people to tell us the things that they really mean to say and they frequently will talk in circles around to get to say, because that's the formal thing to do. And sometimes you just got to really get them to say the thing they actually mean. Okay, so remember how earlier I said, I was like, I'm afraid of looking butch, and then Tobin was like, cut your hair, and I was like, fine. So I feel like a thing that queer people tend to have there's a lot of dialogue about is sort of a queer angst, like where do I fit in the community? Which alphabet am I? And how do I feel about this in relation to my family and my friends? And what does that mean for like the people I'm dating? And there's just a lot of angst in trying to figure out who you are. But I don't really hear about that when I hear stories about queer people. And so this specifically was, this story was about me actually trying to figure out what it is that I had internalized about looking masculine and not just hiding behind my really long hair. And I got paired up with this other really great radio producer, Rachel Matlow, and she sort of like guided me through basically my emotional journey of like, what is it that I'm scared of? And she got me to the point where I felt comfortable saying that I'm gonna cut my hair. And then Tobin was like, we'll just get the same haircut, it'll be fine. And yeah, so I would say that for this, it's just that we always want to be there for somebody to try to figure something out, because it's not fun to do stories about people who are super confident in who they are. That makes you an insta-gay. Okay, out of the way facilitator. We try whenever we can to pair people up to talk and get out of the way, because all of the things. So I'm going to play a clip of one of our favorite episodes called Here's What It's Like, and it's about our coworker, David Gable, who's maybe in his 50s, I want to say, a white gay man who came to us and said that he's been living HIV positive for a while now, and he has no idea what younger people do nowadays. Like, do they know about the AIDS crisis? What is it like now with PrEP? And like, we didn't have any answers for him. So we found a younger man in early 30s, I believe. His name is Dominique, and he's also HIV positive. And the two of them had a really deep conversation about what it means, what it's like now to live HIV positive.
When you hear someone my age talk about the 80s or what it was like or everybody was dying, what do you think?
We're still dying. It's just that it's different. I think I see a lot of my young black youth dying still to this day. Now it changed. The communities that are dying changed. Mm-hmm. So, and it's not talked about as often, but it's still around. AIDS crisis is still around.
How many friends of yours have you lost?
So many. I've lost so many people.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. People say, it's not the 80s anymore. People not dying from it. Yes, they are.
Okay, that's the end of the clip. So I guess my summary here is just that sometimes we're not the right people to be doing the interviewing, and we have to let other people speak. And our last thing is, how does your queerness inform your life and experiences? Okay, so we, from the very beginning, said that we didn't want to be a definition show. We didn't want people to come on and just define who they are and let's talk about it. Because that's interesting to a certain extent, but we really like storytelling. We want to tell stories about how queerness informs somebody's life. So our producer, Matt Collette, is obsessed with Harry Potter. He's going to Harry Potter World this weekend. He's taking Thursday and Friday off, going to Harry Potter World. And one of the things he told us was he doesn't believe that Dumbledore is gay. And I remember saying, but J.K. Rowling said he's gay. And then Matt just launched into a thing, and we're like, great, we're going to make a story about this. Here, I'm going to play this clip. It's a little bit long, but I appreciate it because of the sound effects.
And as time went on and I got to know Dumbledore, but this is before the publication of Philosopher's Stone, so bear in mind, at this point, I've been with him for 7 years. I knew he was gay. I just knew he was gay.
As a queer person who is always trying to push characters together, hoping they're going to be queer, I did not read that at all when I first read Deathly Hallows. That totally came out of nowhere for me when she announced it.
This announcement happened around the time I was coming out, so you might expect it would be a pretty big deal for a fan like me. But it mostly rang flat because the scene Rowling is talking about is this tiny interaction between Dumbledore and this guy named Gellert Grindelwald. This is barely in the books and definitely not in the movies, so let me fill in a couple of the details myself. Flashback to Dumbledore as a young man, talking to another wizard. Hello, you must be Gellert Grindelwald. I can tell because you're so handsome. It's true, I am so handsome and also quite charming. And together we are two of the most powerful wizards in the world. Yes, we are more powerful than all wizards, and also all muggles, but we must use our power responsibly. Or we could use that power to rule over all. Later, after Grindelwald has followed through on his super obvious evil plan. Grindelwald, you need to stop being evil. I'll never stop. Then I guess we have to duel. Magic. Oh no, I am defeated. But before this duel ends, I shall cast one final spell. Magic. You killed my sister. No! I have defeated Grindelwald, but at a terrible cost. And that, Rowling says, was so damaging that Dumbledore just never let himself fall in love again. But really, guys, he's gay. She swears.
So I don't think we would have gotten that if Matt, first of all, wasn't gay and also loved Harry Potter and thought about it very critically. And that I love telling stories like these because they're just so much fun. But that's sort of the end of our Jad Abumrad-inspired Nancy podcast Bill of Rights. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. So we definitely want to do questions now. I don't know if you want to say something quickly about AAJA, because that's why we're in part why we're here. Yeah.
We have a wireless mic so our home audience can hear the question.
Okay. Yeah. Fair. If you want to take this mic for a second.
Hi, I'm Juliana Reyes. I'm the president of AAJ Philly, and AAJ Philly is the local chapter of a nonprofit that is all over the country and also in Asia, and it creates community around Asian and Pacific Islander journalists. So we help each other get jobs, we sing karaoke, we support each other when we're having a hard time at work, and we would love to have you join if you're interested. And you can hit me up you can email me. Again, my name is Juliana Reyes, and I'm a reporter at the Inquirer and the Daily News. So yeah, thanks so much for coming.
You don't necessarily have to be Asian to join AAJ.
And you can just be an ally. Yes, yes.
So if people have questions, there is a wireless mic, and so people at home who are watching us can hear the questions as well. That'd be great. Does anyone have any questions?
This question is for Laura. For an investigative show, I would imagine that it would be hard to constantly resist the impulse to make your narrative thread your investigative process. Like, you're going on every step of the journey and you're finding out more information and you're uncovering bits and pieces here and there, and that's just a natural narrative arc. And so I'm curious to hear, there probably are instances where that does work, and so kind of if there are things that make you decide, okay, we're going to go with that as the structure, or things, when you decide to do that and when you decide not to.
That's a really good question. I think our goal is always to tell a good story. So ideally there's, a person who is experiencing something and we can kind of go along with them on their journey. One of the challenges with investigative journalism is that there's such a focus on harm and accountability that sometimes our main characters end up getting basically just couched as victims only. And so that's something that we struggle against. I think it's kind of a trope that I learned that, like I said, I didn't do investigative work before I started working at Reveal. And then I went to the Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference, IRE, and I was like, oh, damn. These people are all like, get the bad guy. Who did they victimize? That's kind of the culture of it. And so that's something that we try to buck when we can. And in terms of the investigation becoming the story, I think with the Pizzagate episode that I played, it was so sprawling and there was so much stuff that we spent time on that didn't make it into the hour, thankfully, that it was trying to bring the story about the internet into the real world as much as possible. And I think part of not making the investigation the whole story can be just getting out into the real world and spending as much time as possible with people and less time bringing reporters into the studio and being like, here's my stack of documents, which I've used that trope also many times. Sometimes that's the big thing that happens in the reporting is like you get all these documents and then they explain something. So there are kind of all these investigative tricks that we try to be judicious with, but they come up a lot. So I think it's just something we struggle with and try to put the story first and find people. I always think about the episode that Nicole Hannah-Jones did for This American Life on school segregation, the problem we all live with. And, in her investigative work on school segregation, she has 1 million findings. But in the radio hour, there were really only a few. And that's what I try to go towards when I'm working on, especially if it's like a whole hour for Reveal, is like there may be a lot of findings in a print version of the piece, but for the radio version, maybe just sprinkle a few key moments throughout that are just the investigative findings and let the story do most of the work. Mm-hmm.
I was curious for Neena about the process of planning topics for the episodes. So I know some of the topics are, a little bit more broad. And then luckily with this, national spotlight, we always have new topics to talk about. So I was curious how long that takes for planning and then just the process from that to actually coming live.
So you're talking about the daily specifically?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, so every morning we go to the 9:30 meeting. There's like one person on the team that goes to meet with all the editors, and basically all the editors go around this room. All the masthead people are there too, and they talk about the big stories that are going to be coming out in the paper that day. And someone on the audio team takes notes, and then we have a meeting just for the audio team right after that morning meeting with all the editors, where everyone kind of sits around and talks about what happened at the 9:30 meeting and what stories might lend themselves to audio. There's some that we try to get ahead of. So if we know that an editor told us, that, oh, there's this reporter that's working on this feature, it's going to come out in 2 weeks. Do you want to link up with them so that they can go out with a recorder, or that maybe you can accompany them or something like that? Then, that's ideal. But sometimes, we just get a reporter, they're like, I'm on deadline, I have all this tape that I took on my phone, and, can you use any of it? And we try to work with that too. But, we try to think about, Mondays and Fridays tend to be more of feature-y kinds of stories. Sometimes Monday's news, because with this administration, it's really hard to tell. But, so sometimes we have a few longer turnaround stories that come on Mondays or Fridays, and then in the middle of the week is more of oh, this thing just happened, how do we address it? So we try to do a mix of what's the biggest news story of the day? How do we talk about it? And sometimes the biggest news story of the day doesn't really lend itself to narrative, and so we just put it in headlines, this thing happened, but it comes at the end of the episode. It's an important thing for you to know, but we're not really going to spend a whole episode talking about it.
This question is for Neena, is it? I noticed that you talked about curiosity and those two kinds of curiosities. When do you, I have a hard time figuring out, I've always heard producers say oh, that satisfied curiosity. That's the end of that path of inquiry. Who decides whose curiosity? Is it your curiosity? Is it the lead producer's curiosity? Is it the reporter of that story's curiosity? Is it the host's curiosity? Whose curiosity is being quenched?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I think it's a negotiation. I know with still processing, for instance, the hosts bring a variety of curiosities to the table, and then we talk about what's a curiosity that's just a curiosity, and what's a curiosity that merits a whole story behind it. And sometimes the way that I think of it is when you don't make a story about some of those curiosities that are great, but maybe aren't the best suited for a story, you're cutting out the mediocre and you're making space for something really wonderful by not indulging every curiosity that you have. I think for the daily, there's a lot of discussion on the team, why is this interesting? Why is this important? What are the stakes? Does does this help people understand what's going on in this like news cycle where so much is happening all the time? Like, I think that there's just a lot of conversations that happen in the room and a lot of like hashing out as to, you know, what episode should come out tomorrow? What's more of like a day 2 story? What's more of like a, you know, do we need some kind of longer turnaround explainer or something that we should actually hold off on and like wait until the story develops a little further before we like release this episode? I wish I had more of an answer for you that was a little cut and dry, but it's just like super messy.
So this is for Kathy, but really for everyone. So like we were talking about having emotional moments in tape. And I was wondering like how you sort of, like what the line is sort of between like a personal experience and then sort of like using it for radio and like how you like think about that. And then, yeah, and I guess like for other people about like when you're interviewing people or you're producing someone like and they're crying or like, I don't know, like when do you know to use the thing, or like is there ever a line that's crossed where you're like, no, I shouldn't, or like do you like ask questions to like make them cry, not to make them cry more, but you know what I mean, to like get the moment and like, yeah, like how do you like navigate that?
I think on our show, it's a very personal decision. I think that I've gone way more into my personal life than Tobin has, because he's more comfortable being a more of a reporter than, I guess, what do I do? Like memoir type things. So it's a really personal decision. And then when we ask our guests to come on the show, what we ask them for is to be vulnerable to the point that they're comfortable with. If they're not comfortable going past any certain point, we never push them to. So it's wherever you are. And sometimes we'll interview somebody multiple times, and the first time they're not very willing to talk. And then the second or third time, they start to open up. So I think it's just such a personal decision. And the questions that we ask always try to get at honesty and things that are genuine more than pure emotion, I would say.
I could say something about crying. I remember like my first time that I went out into the field with Reveal's host, Al Letson, when I was working with him on his previous show, State of the Reunion. And it was my first like full-time radio job, and we were in Birmingham, Alabama, and we were doing all these different stories, and one of them was about this one iron ore mine in Birmingham that hadn't been as segregated as others, so black and white miners would work alongside each other. And we were trying to find a black miner and a white miner who had worked around the same time, even if they didn't like directly work together, who could talk about what that was like to be underground and come up again, and the rest of the world is super segregated, but you're in this work situation that's not. And I remember like we had asked all these miners to come talk to us, and it was sort of mediated by this community group, and like 20 people came. We were expecting like 2, so I was kind of running interference off to the side, talking to all these people, trying to kind of just protect Al, who was with a different producer who would collaborate with us sometimes from NPR. The NPR producer was like a very seasoned, like 50-something guy who'd worked for NPR forever, and I was like kind of keeping all these other miners to the side and talking with them a little bit and taping with them, and then Al and this NPR producer had like the 2 main guys. This is a lot of setup for not a very satisfying story, but anyway, I was over on the side and then eventually came back and was like, how did it go, with the 2 guys that we really wanted to hear from? And the NPR producer was like, it was great. We got tears. We got him to cry. And I was like, oh, I feel like really weird about that. But I guess like it struck me at the time as like very callous. And that I think that can be a mindset that goes into when you're turning around a lot of stories and you just want to like get some emotional, you want to deliver some emotional moment. And so I think, like, I don't think I would really talk about it that way, but at the same time, like, it's part of the job to bring people in a weird situation to a point where they would feel comfortable becoming emotional. And then just one other little thing about crying. We had a moment recently on Reveal, I think we ended up using it in some of the family separation stories that I was working on. Our host was interviewing Aura Bogado, who's one of our immigration reporters, and she was talking about this weird office building where kids were being held who were separated. It wasn't even a shelter. It was just like a random office building in Phoenix with no facilities. And she mentioned that like there was an item in the lease, like a line item that said no singing or whistling and like no noise outside. And for some reason that just like really got Al super choked up and emotional, and he just couldn't recover. Like, I've been in a lot of interviews with him, and I've only seen him like break down a few times. And that was for like that, like a show that we were doing for that week. And for that episode, I felt like basically Al kept breaking down, and Aura then got upset, and they were talking about like, how do you hold it together when you're reporting on these very, very painful stories? And it just didn't feel right to bring that into that particular story that was really more about the families and the kids and what this company was doing, where they were holding the children in this office building. But then we did another episode a few weeks later, and I can't remember if it made it into the broadcast, but we brought that clip back to kind of set up after a while, like, you know, we'd been covering this for weeks and weeks, to kind of set up like the backstory of what it had been like to cover it and the kind of story we were going to get into. So it's just like I find that it's always delicate figuring out how to like use tears, you know, but that's basically what you're doing when you're making those kind of decisions.
I might ask one sort of broad question that anyone can answer, each of you can answer. What do you all produce a lot. You're saying there's 40 episodes in your latest season. Laura makes a weekly show. You work on a daily show right now. How do you keep learning and sort of expanding your, audio storytelling or audio? I don't want to use toolkit. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going first. Listening. I listen a lot, and sometimes you're tired of listening because you listen all day at work. But listening to things that are interesting, listening to things that other people are making, the people that you admire, new people that you've never heard of, listen to the stuff that they make and figure out the stuff that you like, and then steal it to try to make your own thing and see if it works. If it doesn't work, then try something else. I think that's my main thing. I've definitely stolen from her. So,
It's cool. I also look at things outside of audio a lot. I'm going to tell the story that I told you on the train about the dance movie documentary.
Okay.
There's this really, really beautiful documentary called Bronx Gothic, and it's about this dancer, Akui. I can't remember her last name, but she has this one-woman show, and she talks about, like, you see her dancing, kind of like doing almost like kind of like seizure-like movements for like 30 minutes, and that's the first 30 minutes of her one-woman show. And she said she was really interested in the point where audience members stop asking, like, what's going on, and when's this gonna end, and what is she doing, and they stop asking that question, and they just accept it. And they just like sit with her and bear witness to whatever it is that she's experiencing before they go into like later parts of that documentary. I don't really know like what that means entirely, like in the moment when I was watching, and why that struck me so much. But I think just like recognizing the feeling and recognizing that I was moved can sometimes inspire things later, and not trying to rush that process has been really helpful for me. And oftentimes those moments of inspiration are coming from things that aren't purely audio or aren't, part of the podcasting space as I know it, but that are just from so many different kinds of art or other everyday experiences.
How do you keep track of them?
Oh, that's a good. I tell my friends on the train, or sometimes I haven't figured out how to organize like all the notes in my phone. So I have all these like random notes, but then I also put notes about like various things in the same note. So it'll be like a grocery list, and there'll be a doctor's appointment, and then it'll be like the documentary that I saw, and then it'll be like, so just all these different things, and then I don't label them properly. So it's always like I'm gonna open a note, and it's like a surprise. I don't know what I'm gonna find. So that's how I keep my life spicy.
I try to make like weird challenges for myself. Like I got an assignment to go to Texas to this really small town before the 2016 presidential election, like during the campaign, where I was supposed to be profiling these super right-wing donors who gave a ton of money to Ted Cruz. And one of their like main things that they really cared about was that they're super, super homophobic, and they have, one of them's a pastor, and he has his own church, and it's a very small town, and they basically rule the town. So I was like, okay, I'm going into their territory. I'm pretty visibly gay. Like, what is this going to be like? This is like a pretty grim, like, they're not going to talk to me. They live in a mansion. Like, how am I going to get something happening here? And I also was like, I'm going to have fun doing the story. It's like, I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm going to have fun. So I just decided I would try to have as much fun as I could, and I ended up like finding their barber, who was just, they're like sort of like everyday billionaires, so they just go to like the barber on Main Street in their town, and he really, really, really didn't want to talk to me, but I just hung around, and he didn't like physically make me leave. So eventually he told me a little bit about them and their haircut. So I was like, okay, like it was kind of fun. It wasn't like super dark. So that's like, I try to do stuff like that if I get an assignment, to keep it like, just make it surprising for myself, I think is the goal.
Maybe we have time for one more question, but there's also refreshments and wine and stuff back there, and we can kind of keep talking after this. But I think we have to clear out in the next 20 minutes or so. So to give time for that aspect of the evening, maybe we should get to that now. But unless anyone has like a burning question that they think we should all hear. Okay, well, thank you so much. This is great. Yeah. Thanks to Kathy too, Neena Pathak.